Good morning, everyone. So today's topic that we're going to be discussing is safety and basically what it means in theater. My dog is saying hello. So anyways, what will most likely happen is there might be two options here where there will be a link to the video itself and one linked or overlaid on top of the PowerPoint presentation. Whichever you prefer, you can always just have it running in the background. So, one of the first things we have to talk about is an organization, and that organization is known as OSHA. In 1970, Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and it basically created this organization. To this day, this organization still exists. It is very prominent. I will have a link to their actual website because I'm going to have an entire course dedicated to explaining what OSHA does. But basically what they do is they set and enforce standards, and they also can provide training, outreach, education, and assistance regarding a whole slew of different topics. It is a requirement of OSHA that employees, basically, or in this case, students, be given a safe environment, healthy workplace that is reasonably free of occupational hazards. Now, obviously, working with power tools, there's a lot of times that obviously with these tools, some can be considered quite dangerous. Even some of the hand tools have sharp edges and therefore should not be taken lightly. A little background on OSHA if you did not know. OSHA is a part of the United States Department of Labor. The OSHA's administrators basically answer to the Secretary of Labor, who is a member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States. It is a right of absolutely anyone to notify OSHA if they ever feel they are put in a situation or their workplace is ever considered slightly dangerous. Some of the things that are directly related with OSHA and theater is some of the basic standards that are required for employees / students is providing fall protection. This basically means anytime you are going off the ground at least 4 feet, you should be in a harness to help prevent you from falling off and potentially injuring yourself. Confined spaces and safety in that regard. You shouldn't ever be in a position where you are uncomfortable. Oftentimes, some of the set pieces that may be built create small confined spaces. Most of the time, if that is ever the case, I myself or anyone who volunteers would only have to go in there. I never want to put anyone in harm's way or have them do anything that they feel uncomfortable about. Preventing exposure to harmful chemicals. There are some times in some theater productions in which some materials that are needed can create sort of noxious smells or poisonous gas in order to create some particular project, mainly in paint and props. None of the chemicals or none of the items that we use in theater, or at least in this class, are designated as these harmful chemicals. But if they ever do get introduced, I would ensure that everyone is properly trained on how to handle it, maintain it, use, and dispose of. Putting guards on dangerous machines. A lot of the tools that we work with have safety features basically attached to them. And that basically just means that these are for your own safety and basically to maintain a proper use for that particular tool. Providing training for certain dangerous jobs in a language and vocabulary that any worker can understand. Anytime that we work with these various tools, it is my responsibility, being the instructor, to ensure that everyone knows how to properly turn on, turn off and operate every single tool that we would engage with during the class. This is mainly important simply because the fact that a lot of them can cause serious harm and or damage to not only yourself if improperly used, but to others around you in case something went wrong. One of the things that OSHA does provide or has improved upon are known as MSDS. These are basically safety data sheets, and they are designed to provide both workers and emergency personnel with the proper procedures for handling and or working with a particular substance. Now, this doesn't always mean that it is a dangerous substance. It could be absolutely anything, all the way down from basic latex paint. And these sheets basically lay out sort of the physical data, melting point, boiling point, flash point, etc. The toxicity level, if it is fairly toxic, you'll obviously have to have the safety precautions provided in handling those particular materials. Health effects, if ever consumed, if you ever get it in contact with your skin. The first aid, in case something does happen, you have this information there. Storage, disposal, what type of protective equipment should be used whenever handling all this, and then spill, leak procedures, and so much more. In 2012, they revised all of this into a standard 16 section format. And all of this information is basically blocked out in these standard forms because prior to this, just about any company could have all of this information still provided, but all of the important like first aid, health effects may be near the middle or near the bottom, and it may be difficult to actually locate it if all of your pieces or MSDS sheets aren't uniform. So, what are these sections and what does this actually look like? This is an example of one of those material safety data sheets. It's only the first 9 sections, but it's a basic layout for what should be under each form. The image beside it is the full 16 section layout, and it basically gives you a brief rundown as to what each one should cover. In theater, for the most part, 1 through 9 is the most important really for us to be paying attention to. And these basically are the identification of the substance, what it is, and the company that has produced it. The hazard identification, this is basically a brief little section in which the hazard level should be indicated to inform anyone quickly as to what protective equipment should be used when working with that material. Section 3 is basically the composition information. It's basically the general makeup and the ingredients used to actually create that particular product. Obviously, this is important to note in case someone has a allergic reaction to a specific ingredient. It is not always known immediately what ingredients may be used. So if you are unfamiliar with a particular product, you can always go to this section of one of these safety data sheets and quickly go through to make sure that it would not react to anything you may be allergic to. Section 4 is the first aid measures, and this basically just sort of says or runs down all the information in regards to what you should do, relevant routes of exposures, inhalation, skin, or eye contact, and it should basically lay out how to deal with each of these sections. For the most part, if you ever consume or get it in your eyes, those are usually the situations in which we would need to get some other medical professional in order to properly maintain an effective work section. Section 5 is basically the firefighting measures. It'll basically lay out for you, for the most part, how or if the material is flammable and what should happen in case it ever would catch on fire. Accidental release measure is section 6, and this basically will run down sort of the methods of material used for containment. For example, covering a drain or capping procedures, just to ensure that nothing sort of escapes the area that you're in. It'll also sort of explain sort of the cleanup procedures, the appropriate technique for neutralization, decontamination, cleanup, vacuuming, or what type of materials are fairly absorbent. It may be a little scary at first, but a lot of times it'll be something like you accidentally spill paint on the ground. Some of the easy ways of cleaning that up without creating a large, bright purple mess on your project and or the floor or something else is using sawdust. Sawdust is extremely absorbent, and it'll basically absorb all of the paint in such a way that you just let it dry, and then you can easily clean everything up. Section 7 is handling and storage. This is basically just to ensure that if something is fairly toxic or flammable, that you have a proper area for all of that to be stored. A lot of spray paints are considered flammable and explosive, so it is oftentimes that you would find these in a locked cabinet to ensure that nothing may accidentally cause a spark to fly over and puncture one of these, or if there happened to have been a leak, that nothing can happen there. Exposure controls and personal protection. This basically lays out what type of personal protective equipment should be used whenever handling these particular materials. For the most part, whenever we are working with power tools, hand tools, and just general everyday work within the theater, you almost always want to have safety goggles and earplugs. We'll cover those briefly or fairly soon. The reason that this is important is basically to ensure that everything is maintained in such a way that you, as an individual or anyone working around you, is protected in such a way that nothing should happen if everything is properly maintained. So we could cover the rest of these sections, but I will simply be providing a link that goes super in depth into all of this, because again, even an MSDS sheet can take quite a long time to actually and properly talk about, and we are just covering this as a quick basic in terms of safety. One of the first pieces of PPE equipment, or personal protective equipment, that we're going to cover are work gloves. Now, this isn't just to say that any kind of work glove is perfect for all types of projects. There is actually a lot of cases in which you want something specific for a particular project. Some of the typical types of hand protection that we come across or see in theater are metal mesh gloves. These are basically like little chain link gloves, and they're great whenever you're working with sharp objects such as knives or anything like that, to ensure that you do not accidentally cut a finger or nick anything else while you're working with that particular product. One of the more common gloves that we sort of see in theater are known as leather gloves, and they basically just sort of help protect you from rough surfaces. A lot of times you may get some lumber that may not be the prettiest, and you may want to wear these gloves just to ensure that whenever you're running your hands over that particular material, you don't accidentally, again, nick yourself in terms of some edges of wood can be fairly sharp, or if you want to prevent yourself from getting splinters. That is one of the best things to have. Also, in terms of metal, obviously, anytime that you have metal, if you've never worked with metal before, a lot of the factory edges can be quite sharp and is not oftentimes burred up. These are basically little slivers of metal on the inside of steel tubing, and those can be fairly sharp and hazardous if you accidentally have your hand put into one of those and you rub it against it, and it can have a pretty nice paper cut. If you've ever had one of those, it is way worse. Vinyl and or neoprene gloves. Again, we don't typically work with toxic chemicals, but if we ever were, these are the type of gloves that you would want to use, as they are fairly corrosive resistant. And that basically just means that if you accidentally have a spill or something else happen, that your hands would be protected. Rubber gloves, again, fairly unique in the terms of what it's used for. What it is typically used for is sort of protecting yourself whenever you are around electricity. We don't work directly with live electricity for the most part. There are a few things that would require some work with electricity, but nothing any of you students should ever have to work on. Some of the other sort of subsects of these particular types of gloves are the cotton, Kevlar, and welding. Cotton gloves are sort of a generic type of work glove. They're sort of great for just sort of everyday use when working with a lot of lumber, glue, screws, nails, hammers, or any other type of power tool. The Kevlar are sort of exactly like they sound. They are extremely durable. They are extremely sort of, sorry, my dog is all over me right now. Extremely resistant to sort of cuts, abrasions, and anything of the sort. Then you have welding gloves, which, of course, if you ever heard of it, is for specifically welding. Unfortunately, this particular campus does not afford the capability of any kind of metal work. I'm working on seeing if it is possible in the future. But these particular welding gloves are extremely heat resistant, and they are great for sort of working in and around most metals, especially prior to and after you have welded something, because one of the tricks there is hot metal looks like cold metal. And if you want to know why I know this, I have significantly burned myself many, many a times for not understanding or remembering that simple thing. One of the other sort of unique gloves here at the end of that second picture is the anti-vibration. It's sort of again, unique set of gloves in which they're mainly used in machinery. And this is basically just sort of helps prevent any sort of tremors from happening or anything happening directly to you through whatever project you are working on. With all of that, there are a lot of occasions in which work gloves should never be used. Some of the machines that we work with in and around any type of typical scene shop can spin at a high rate of revolutions per minute. Whenever you are using these particular types of tools, it is absolutely imperative that you never wear gloves. The reason for this, which is only sort of a minor increase in sort of the understanding, is that with that high rate of revolution, if your hand were to ever get caught into one of these machines and you were wearing a glove, what will most likely happen is the glove will then get bound up into that machine, in which case, if it is still attached to your hand, it is going to take your hand with you. What we basically want to have done is, if you ever had an accident in which your hand did not have a glove on it and one of these tools happened to nick your hand, what will basically happen is that should be it. It should just be nicked, and you should remain safer than if you were wearing an actual glove. Some of these tools include a bench grinder, bench sanders, drill presses, table saws, and routers and router tables. Not only do we not want to be wearing gloves, any student that has long hair should have it tied back in such a way that it would never sort of drape forward over yourself whenever you are working on a particular tool. And absolutely like no jewelry or dangling jewelry that could also sort of drape down and get potentially caught up in any one of these machines. The second piece of PPE that we're going to cover is eye protection. Now, for the most part, if you've ever taken a science class, you're quite familiar with that third picture at the very bottom, or its sort of brethren, the one right above it. Most eye protection comes in a wide range or form. Basically, the absolute most important thing whenever you are looking or considering the use of safety glasses or safety goggles is a special number. And that special number is Z87.1. This basic number is a reference to the American National Standard for occupational and educational personal eye and face protection devices. This standard sort of ensures that the personnel's eye, or the eye of the personnel wearing them, is protected in such a way from impact, non-ionizing radiation, and liquid splash exposure. Now, it doesn't guarantee, as you'll see in a few slides, that nothing can go wrong whenever you are wearing these. So depending on, again, whatever tool you are working, you may want to consider revising what type of eye protection you are wearing. So here we have three typical glasses, which basically just go over the bridge of your nose and go behind your ear. The other three examples are sort of the full face shields. The typical one that you may be more familiar with is the one that just basically caps your head and has a sort of thin plastic sheet that just goes over your face entirely. Some of the other ones basically fully encompass as much of your face as possible, and those are a little bit more unique and a little bit more expensive. Some of the other types that we can come across, and again, since we don't use any of these, we don't necessarily have them available, but they do exist, and that is with metal cutting and or welding. Now, the difference here is that metal cutting, which are sort of the first three in that row, which basically just cover your eyes and basically then bridge over your nose, is that these particular ones have a tint or screen that only helps sort of block out a lot of the heat coming from a plasma torch. And it basically just sort of allows you to see a little bit clearer to sort of help maintain a sort of clean cut whenever you're using those particular tools. The welding goggles or welding masks that you can see here, again, come in wide ranges of variety and types, basically have what is known as sort of a lens, again, which can either be auto darkening or a passive lens helmet, which has a UV and IR coated dark tinted glass with a fixed value. Now, the value can range anywhere from 10 and up, up being 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. The more common type that you'll see is a number 10, and this is one of the lower end levels, and that basically means a lot more of the light can come in through that lens whenever you are welding. Some of the darker ones that you sort of can see all the way up to, I believe, it might just be 13. It's been a while. Is sort of the highest level, which means that it blocks out a lot of that extra light that is being produced by a welding unit. Now, one of the reasons why you absolutely need one of these welding helmets is the arc that is created from the end of the tool actually creates a light that is brighter than the sun. So obviously you never want to stare at this for a long period of time, if even for just a few seconds, because it can greatly affect your overall eyesight if you are not properly aware. As I mentioned before, accidents can happen, but a lot of times if you are wearing the right gear or equipment, you can help avoid them. Now, these top two pictures are obviously of an individual or individuals that had something occur whenever they were using a nail gun or a hammer and nail. It could be either one. Now, in this first picture, obviously, if the individual was wearing a full face shield, he may have had the possibility of avoiding having that happen. What typically happens whenever you have something like this happen, though, is whenever you're using a pneumatic tool, either improperly or just sort of joking around, or even as an extreme accident, is the force of the pneumatic is going to shoot that nail at a high rate of speed. What can typically happen here is that it will blow through the material and then bounce off of some other object, which then in turn bounces it back towards you or bounces it to someone else. That is why it's always important to be paying attention to not only your surroundings, but the surroundings of others, to ensure that they know what kind of operation is going on in and around you. These second two pictures, the one where it's actually inside of a glass, and then that small part of a disc is being lodged in the face mask, the full face mask. These again can sort of be sort of common mistakes or accidents. The one with the disc at the bottom is probably one that should have been avoided altogether. And in that particular instance, the tool may have been used properly, which caused the actual disc that was being used in that tool to either be lodged into something or bound up into a project or an item, and it caused it to basically shatter. One of the other things that can happen there is that the disc can get worn down from prolonged use, which can then cause it to become brittle and then break entirely as well. So one of the next pieces that we will be covering in PPE is earplugs. Once again, there is a little bit of variety when it comes to what type of earplugs that we can see most commonly in theaters and or any kind of workshop, and those are your disposable / reusable or your ear muff types. Now, just because you may have one or another does not mean that they are all created equal. Each particular brand and or type has what is called a noise reduction rating, or an NRR. And it's basically sort of a unit of measure that is determined for the effectiveness of hearing protection devices. And it basically decreases the overall level of sound that can actually go through those particular pieces and actually enter your eardrums. This is very important because a lot of the tools that we will see in a second can and almost always exceed sort of the basic threshold for human hearing in order to prevent any kind of hearing loss. So here we have two different diagrams that can show you the decibel level. Basically, these are sort of a unit of measurement for how loud something is. And in this first chart, we can sort of see the wide range of power tools and the actual decibel level that each emits. Now, 85 is basically the threshold that is most commonly used in order to cause concern for any kind of excess level above that. This basically just means anytime that you are working with these power tools, you must always want to have some form of ear protection in. Even if you're using it just for a few minutes, or a few hours, you want to make sure that you have ear protection in. The second chart here is sort of a universal sort of decibel scale, and it also sort of shows other types of equipment and or tools or weapons or jet planes and a level that they exceed in terms of the decibel level. We then come to respirators. Now, this can be a tricky subject, so I'm going to give it in terms of theater and how we best use them. Respirators come in sort of two forms. There is air purifying and then atmosphere supplying. There is a distinctive difference. Air purifying basically just means that the material that is used or being used to help sort of protect your lungs breathe a little better, so that way you don't breathe in any of the toxic fumes and or dust particles, would mean that the air purifying just basically filters out certain levels or micron levels of material. This is basically used whenever you're working with sawdust, plaster dust, and or any other type of material that can cause fine particles to sort of build up in the air around you. One of the other important things about sort of any kind of working environment and or scene shop is to have a very well ventilated area so you don't get a buildup of sawdust or any other particles in the air. Now, there are some particular brands and types which then filter out more or less depending on, again, that particular brand. For the most part, what you will be given whenever you sort of enter campus, if you are at any point coming on campus, is going to be a basic paper film, and it does prevent a lot of different levels of particles from coming in or being expelled from an individual. Some of the higher end ones, such as N95, which you've probably heard quite about recently, basically prevent a lot smaller particles from entering or being expelled from any given source. Which then comes to the atmosphere supplying. Atmosphere supplying is basically exactly how it sounds. It allows the individual to basically sort of rebreathe sort of the air around you. This is mainly for whenever you are working with the aerosols in theater, such as with spray paints, other painting sources, or anything that may or may not have some sort of hazardous or toxic level. Attached to these are usually one, if not two, different types of cartridges. Again, you can sort of change out what type of cartridge that you have equipped, but you almost always want to replace these every time you sort of switch to a different product. The reason for this is that even though you may have it well stored or packed away in a Ziploc bag, once you initially engage that filter with that mask, it is still sort of being consumed. So any kind of natural air going around it will cause that particular filter or cartridge to sort of slowly be used up. So that is one of the important parts to ensure that you sort of maintain that particular piece. Rope and aircraft cable is an important part of rigging. We won't go too in-depth here, but it is part of a safety regulation. In terms of the overall use of rigging, one of the things that happens in theater is most operators, whenever you are working with rope and or aircraft cable, you're going to be using what is known as a safety factor. The safety factor is basically the load carrying capability of a system beyond the expected or actual load. So basically what the safety factor means is you take the actual breaking strength of a particular item, such as aircraft cable, and then you usually divide that by 5 or anywhere between 5 and 10 to give you whatever recommended safety factor or weight that you should be using for that one particular line set. Now, it does mean that each line set can carry that much of a particular load. So that means the more lines that you use on one particular item prevents that overall load from being evenly, or causes that load to be evenly distributed between all of those line sets, allowing you to sort of maintain a bit of a higher level of breaking strength. Ropes, on the other hand, basically will start to lose strength after every knot that is applied to that particular rope. Similar to aircraft cable, rope does have an initial breaking strength and should almost always be considered or have the use of a safety factor whenever you are working with that particular rope. You then have to consider or keep in mind that every time you tie a knot, which is almost always, especially whenever you are working with lifting items or lifting projects up into the air, you have to keep that in mind whenever you are working with these particular ropes. So you want to make sure that you have a style or brand of rope that has an extremely high breaking strength to ensure the safety of everyone around you. The load rail, you may not ever see the load rail unless I do a quick tour backstage for everyone online. But the load rail is basically where stage weights, and we'll cover a lot of this in one of the future lessons, where all of the counterweights are stored and used to help sort of counterbalance any kind of line set being used. This is mainly important just due to the fact of the safety regulations whenever you are working with the load rail has immense regulations in terms of ensuring that everyone is aware of what is going on to ensure nothing comes crashing down and that everything is balanced in such a way. Ladders. Now, I'm going to be a little honest here. For the most part, when it comes to ladder safety, I'm going to say, do as I say, not as I do. I feel quite comfortable whenever I'm using a ladder, so you may see me do something that may or may not be extremely safe. But that's just me. I know I should do better. But in terms of actual ladder safety, almost every time that you are working with a ladder, if you've never worked with a ladder before, there's a few things that do stand out. For the most part, any ladder, especially the A-frame style, which most people should be quite familiar with, has usually one side that you should climb up and climb down on. The other side is basically just sort of support pieces to ensure that the overall frame and structure of the ladder itself is maintained in such a way. It is not ever meant for the weight of an individual to be standing on any of those crossbars. Typically, you want to make sure that whenever you are using a step ladder, that it is in a completely flat area. There are times in which we will be on a rig stage potentially, or it might be in a fairly tight area in which you cannot fully open it up. You either just need to make sure that you have another ladder which is smaller, which may open up, or just work around to the best of your ability. To ensure that you don't ever lose your balance, it is always ideal to ensure that whenever you are climbing or descending any ladder, that you don't have anything in your hand. If you are working on a project such as a lighting focus or working on some crown molding or anything that is above your typical just human height, you want to make sure that someone hands you up any of those tools or other pieces of equipment to ensure that you can maintain your balance. Whenever you are, again, sort of ascending or descending any of these ladders, you want to ensure that you aren't sort of swaying side to side. If the feet of the ladder are in such a way or aren't properly seated on the ground, there's a chance that you may knock or rock the ladder over on its side. And those are things that we want to avoid. Now, typically in class, this will be where I ask, what is wrong with these pictures? As you can sort of see, these individuals are working on a ladder in such a way that is not considered safe by many regards. In the first picture, if it is not clear, this individual has their ladder open inside of a pool. He then is working with a powered tool that has the extension cord almost nearly hitting the water itself. Now, if anyone can guess why this is in particularly unsafe, you're doing a great job. This second image, not gonna lie, would probably be something I or myself have done in the past, but definitely not something that you should ever do. In this particular case, they are using a single frame ladder, which basically is meant to be laid against a wall or some other objects that is stationary in order to climb or descend that particular ladder. This is an extreme case in which an A-frame ladder would have been completely safe for one individual to work on that particular lighting fixture. This last picture is definitely one of those pictures, if you've ever seen a lot of those why women live longer than men, this is one of those images. In this particular image, there wasn't, or there really isn't, a type of ladder that should be used in this particular case. More likely what should have been used is a scaffolding system to actually sort of brace the individual to ensure that they have a flat working area in order to get up to that area that is above the stair landing. So now we get down to sort of electric or lighting. Now, this is again, sort of the basic when it comes to working with lighting and or electricity. For the most part, just a lot of the power tools obviously have a power source. Whenever you are working with these tools, there's obviously a slew and or combination of the PPE that we've seen before, and these should also be following certain guidelines whenever you are working in and around anything. Working on live outlets can be extremely dangerous. There is never a case in which an individual should ever have the protective guard over an outlet uncovered unless you are a master electrician. There should never be a case of that. There's a lot of times in which the power tools that we use have to have something changed and or altered about that particular tool. And when we get to the power tools section, I will go over what those particular tools are. But whenever you are working with those particular tools, you want to make sure that you disconnect that tool from the power source to ensure whenever you are working or changing out a blade on something that you don't have any kind of power running through it, to ensure that the trigger or surge doesn't happen and then turn the tool on. We'll briefly cover lighting equipment here, but we'll also have a brief section later on in the semester. And in case you are wondering, there actually is a lighting class, a lighting design class, which will delve way more in depth into this regard. There's a lot of times in which case a tool should work straight out of the box. You would believe that. There are times in which case that is not always the case. And when it comes to lighting equipment, there are a lot of things that can be modified depending on sort of the type and or brand of lighting equipment that you have. If something is amiss, there's a lot of things that you should check before writing off that particular instrument. Checking all connectors, that's basically just sort of the plug that runs from the ends of the light itself. This is usually just to ensure that the connection type is completely secure and that all sort of pins that are used in that particular tool are connected all together. The next thing that you would want to then check is the wiring of that particular tool. Initially, you would want to make sure that it is properly maintained, but then you also want to ensure that you look at it periodically to make sure that nothing happens over time. One of the other things that we sort of run into is to make sure that everything is connected in such a way that you don't have some of the wiring overlapping one another, which would cause sort of a power arc between those nodes, which then can lead to an electrical fire. As mentioned before, there's a lot of times in which gloves are advised. This is definitely one of those cases. Whenever you are working with lighting equipment, the heat that is emanating or sort of built up with that particular light or lamp being turned on is extremely hot. You want to make sure that you're wearing gloves to ensure that your hands don't have to deal with the immense heat that is being emitted from that instrument. Coming down to fire safety. For the most part, since this is an online class, may not particularly pertain to you all as individuals, but it is an important part of theater safety. This is a prime example of a picture of someone not being aware of what is going on around them. Now, it may not seem like much, especially if someone has ever worked with some of these gas canisters themselves, but periodic sparks like this hitting a particular gas can be extremely dangerous, especially if something were to have been unscrewed or screwed in improperly. Any kind of spark such as those could ignite any of that compressed gas and cause serious injury. So that is why it is almost always important to make sure that you are aware of what is going on around you and not just the project that you are working on. A lot of times you may be working on a particular project which may cause sparks to fly, and if someone is next to you and has been working on a project which created a lot of sawdust, obviously sparks or fire and sawdust can create a fire. So it's always important you are paying attention and aware of your surroundings. The fire safety, obviously this would be where I point out in the theater all of the fire exits are and everything like that. But we'll just sort of run down through this fairly quickly. In the event of a fire, obviously dialing 911 is most important. Also would be going and notifying campus police, activating the fire alarm. There are quite a few typically in plain sight and available to gain access to it. Putting out the fire if you know how to properly maintain or put out the fire if it is small, or you know how to use a fire extinguisher. But if it is a fire that is too large for you, obviously getting out as soon as possible is most important. In theaters cases, typically, one of the major features or one of the things that is also added is what is known as a fire curtain. A fire curtain, which will basically drop down, separating the audience from the stage itself, and this basically helps prevent or contain the fire as best as possible. Some of the other systems that had been created in the past and are sometimes still used is what is known as a deluge system. Instead of a curtain being dropped down, basically it drops hundreds of thousands of gallons of water sometimes onto the stage itself, and it basically just floods everything, which should, often more than not, help maintain or put out most of the fire. Evacuating the building and basically waiting for the arrival of fire officials is the best thing to do. And then finally just not re-entering the building until you are told that it is safe. In case of injury. So accidents, of course, are always going to happen. The most extreme things that has happened so far are splinters, and even that has been fairly minimal. It is entirely my responsibility and my job and my passion to ensure that everyone has a safe working environment when you are working with power tools. But I also want you to have a lot of fun. So whenever you do accidentally injure yourself, obviously informing myself or letting someone else know if I'm not immediately available or around is ideal. If absolutely necessary or it comes down to it, seeking medical attention other than what we have available is ideal as well. Whenever you have possibly a serious injury, we would then again go through the proper channels of notifying campus security, which in then turn will notify an ambulance if needed. But this is also sort of the important part about everyone else sort of being aware of what is going on in and around themselves. It is almost always the case in which an accident occurs when someone is not fully aware of what is going on with their particular project, or just happen to be walking through someone else's project and may accidentally get hurt. So it's utmost importance to be paying attention. Which then leads us to some sort of general rules for sort of safe practices. This first one, thinking, it is almost imperative that you just sort of pay attention, think about what you're doing, asking for help if you are unable or you are unsure of how to do something. Asking help, always important. If you ever feel uncomfortable with working on something, don't do it. Seek help, either via myself or another individual to help you or assist you. It is again my responsibility to ensure that everyone does feel comfortable in any kind of working environment. To sort of help minimize any potential accidents from occurring, it is always important to sort of clean up after yourself after you've been working for a little bit, just to give yourself as much of a clean working space as possible, but to sort of help prevent anything from happening. Wearing appropriate shop clothing, again, online forum, not always important, but if you are ever working around tools, it is always important to be wearing fairly loose clothing, mostly cotton blend types or materials. Denim jeans are always ideal simply because they are fairly resistant to a lot of the wear and tear that happens in any given scene shop. Wearing eye protection, again, not always necessary, but always fairly nice to have. You definitely don't want to ever have a scratched cornea. I've had them in the past, even with wearing sunglasses or wearing safety glasses. It can happen. Safety guards, they exist on almost all the tools for a reason, so use them. Ear protection, again, your hearing is extremely important. You may not understand it, but it is quite vital. Too heavy, there's a lot of times in which a lot of the projects that we work create substantially heavy items. They are not meant to be carried by yourself, so it is often ideal to have someone assist you in carrying something, even if it's just a few feet or moving it 1 foot out of the way. We'll cover this mainly whenever we get to the tools themselves, but using the right tool for the right job. Being in the field for as long as I have, almost every scene shop has sort of a running joke that every tool is a hammer, but that is not the case. You definitely don't want to be using a hammer on a wrench or on a nut and bolt. You want to make sure you're using a C-wrench to tighten up anything that requires threading, and then using a hammer only when it is absolutely necessary. Accidents will happen, as I mentioned. Making sure that you let me know whenever they do happen, always ideal. No horseplay. No horseplay is kind of the biggest thing in theater shops. There's a lot of times in which you want to have as much fun as possible, and it is again advised to enjoy yourself while you're working, but working to a point in which that you can be respectful for others working around you, and to ensure their safety and yourself. All right, that is today's lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to email me and I can get back to you, or you can open up a discussion in the discussion section and we can cover it with others in the class. Thank you.